While Texas defenders held the coastline and kept the Cotton Road open, thousands of other Texans were boarding trains and steamboats heading east. They were leaving behind the vast prairies and dusty border towns they knew, traveling to a different kind of war, in a land they'd only heard about in newspapers. These men, farmers, ranchers, store clerks, and cowboys, were joining what would become one of the most famous fighting units in American military history, Hood's Texas Brigade. Officially, the brigade consisted of the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas Infantry Regiments, later joined by the 18th Georgia and the 3rd Arkansas. But everyone called them Hood's Texas Brigade, named after their commander, John Bell Hood, a tall, stern Kentuckian who had made Texas his adopted home. The Texans who filled these regiments were different from the professional soldiers of the East. Many had never worn a uniform before enlisting. They spoke with thick frontier drawls, carried bowie knives alongside their rifles, and had a reputation for being hard to discipline in camp, but absolutely ferocious in battle. One Virginia officer, watching a Texas regiment march past, supposedly remarked, "They look more like a mob of armed citizens than soldiers." His companion replied, "Wait until you see them fight. Then you'll understand." The Texans were about to prove themselves in the bloodiest battles of the war, and the price they would pay would be almost unimaginable. The small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, meant nothing to most Texans. It was just another dot on a map in a state they'd never visited, surrounded by farmland that looked nothing like the Texas prairie. But on September 17, 1862, Sharpsburg became the site of the bloodiest single day in American history, and the 1st Texas Infantry would suffer the highest casualty rate of any regiment in any battle of the entire war. The day started quietly for Hood's brigade. They'd been up since before dawn, but they weren't in the initial fighting. They were being held in reserve, catching what rest they could. Some men managed to get small fires going and started cooking the first decent meal they'd had in days: half-cooked bacon, hardtack softened in the grease, coffee if they were lucky. Private Samuel Houston, a young man from Houston, no relation to the famous general, was just biting into a piece of bacon when the order came. "Fall in! Double quick! The line's breaking!" All around him, men were dropping their breakfast, grabbing their rifles, forming into ranks. There was no time to finish cooking, no time to pack up. The Union Army had broken through Confederate defenses in a cornfield north of town, and if they weren't stopped, the entire Confederate left flank would collapse. Hood's brigade was being thrown into the breach. General Hood led his men at a run toward the sound of gunfire. They could hear it before they could see it, a continuous roar like thunder that never stopped, punctuated by screams and officers shouting orders. Then they entered the cornfield. The corn stood over 6 feet tall, planted in neat rows that stretched in every direction. It was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The Texans advanced through the corn in formation, pushing aside the stalks, trying to maintain their lines in the confusion of the vegetation. The noise grew louder. Somewhere ahead, hidden by the corn, a massive battle was raging. The Texans could hear it, could smell the powder smoke drifting through the stalks, but they couldn't see the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel P.A. Work, commanding the 1st Texas, shouted to keep the men steady and moving forward. "Dress your lines! Keep together! Don't fire until you see them!" Then, suddenly, they did see them. The 1st Texas emerged from the corn into a small clearing and found themselves face to face with Union troops, the Pennsylvania Reserves, and the famous Iron Brigade from Wisconsin and Indiana. The two forces were less than 50 yards apart, close enough to see the expressions on each other's faces. For one frozen instant, Both sides stared in shock. Then the world exploded. Both lines fired at almost the same instant. The sound was deafening, a continuous crashing roar as hundreds of rifles fired as fast as men could load and shoot. White smoke from black powder weapons rolled across the field, making it almost impossible to see. A soldier from the 1st Texas later wrote, "The air seems full of leaden missiles. The dead and wounded go down in scores." The Texans, in their aggressive charge, had pushed too far forward. In the smoke and confusion of the corn, they'd gotten ahead of the other Confederate units that were supposed to be supporting them. Now, the 1st Texas found itself 150 yards in front of the main Confederate line, taking fire from 3 sides. Union soldiers poured bullets into the exposed Texans from the front and both flanks. Men fell in rows, like wheat being cut by a scythe. The regiment's color bearers, the men carrying the regiment's flag, were special targets. Union soldiers knew that if they shot down the flag, it would demoralize the enemy. Private Marshall Hanson carried the 1st Texas flag into the cornfield. He was shot and fell. Private W.H. Day grabbed the falling flag and carried it forward. He was shot and fell. Private R.D. Kingsley seized the colors next. He too was shot down. Finally, Private James Malone took up the flag, and he was killed as well. 4 men, one after another, shot down trying to keep the Texas flag flying. The regiment was being annihilated. The fighting in the cornfield lasted only about half an hour, but in that time, the 1st Texas Infantry was virtually destroyed as a fighting unit. When the survivors finally fell back, not in panic, but in an organized withdrawal under orders, they left behind a field carpeted with their dead and wounded. The numbers tell a story of almost unbelievable carnage. The 1st Texas went into the battle with 226 men. When they assembled after the fight, only 40 could answer roll call. The rest, 186 men, were killed, wounded, or missing. That's an 82.3% casualty rate. More than 8 out of every 10 men in the regiment were casualties. No other regiment in the entire Civil War, North or South, suffered such a high percentage of losses in a single day. Later, after the battle, General Robert E. Lee asked General Hood where his division was. Hood, his face showing the strain of the day, gave a reply that would become famous: "Dead on the field." The entire brigade had suffered terribly. The 4th Texas lost 54% of its men. The 5th Texas lost 57%. The 18th Georgia lost 61%. Together, Hood's Texas Brigade lost more than half its strength in that terrible morning in the cornfield. But even in defeat, and Antietam was technically a draw that forced Lee to retreat back to Virginia, the Texans had gained a reputation. They had charged into a killing zone without hesitation. They had fought until they literally could not fight anymore. And they had proven that when the situation was desperate and a hole in the line needed to be filled, you could count on the Texas Brigade to go where they were sent, no matter the cost. The Army would remember. And the next time the situation was desperate, the Texans would be called on again. 10 months after the cornfield at Antietam, Hood's Texas Brigade marched into Pennsylvania as part of Lee's invasion of the North. The campaign was meant to take the war out of Virginia, to threaten northern cities, to maybe force the Union to negotiate peace. The whole Confederate Army was moving north, and the Texans were part of it. The campaign would climax at a small town called Gettysburg, where the greatest battle ever fought on the North American continent would rage for 3 days in early July. On the second day of the battle, July 2nd, Hood's brigade received orders to attack the Union left flank. Their objective was a rocky hill called Little Round Top. If they could take that hill, they could fire down on the entire Union line and maybe win the battle, maybe even win the war. But between the Texans and Little Round Top lay a nightmarish landscape of massive boulders and rock formations that soldiers would later call Devil's Den. Among the Texans advancing toward Devil's Den was a man named William J. Barbie. He wasn't a regular soldier. He was a scout for General Hood, which meant his job was to range ahead of the army, gather information about enemy positions, and report back. Scouts had to be tough, resourceful, and absolutely fearless. Barbie had all those qualities in abundance. What happened to him during the fight at Devil's Den would become one of the most famous stories of raw courage from the entire battle. The attack began in mid-afternoon. The Texans could see Little Round Top rising ahead of them, but first they had to cross the boulder-strewn Devil's Den. Union soldiers were positioned among the rocks, using them as cover while they fired down on the advancing Confederates. General Hood, riding at the front of the attack, was struck in the arm by a shell fragment that nearly tore his arm off. He would survive, but never fully recover use of the arm. Command of the brigade fell to other officers as Hood was carried from the field. The Texans kept advancing. Officers shouted, "Follow the Lone Star flag to the top of the mountain." The Texas flag led the way forward into the rocks. Barbie was riding his horse through the boulders when the animal was shot and killed beneath him. He crashed to the ground, but immediately scrambled to his feet, grabbed his rifle, and looked for a good shooting position. He spotted a massive boulder rising above the others, a perfect position to fire down on Union troops. Barbie climbed up onto the rock and began shooting with deadly accuracy. A Union soldier shot him in the leg. Barbie tumbled off the rock, landing hard on the ground below. Instead of seeking cover or retreating to get his wound treated, Barbie climbed back up onto the rock. He resumed firing, picking off Union soldiers with his rifle. He was shot in the leg again and fell off the rock a second time. And again, bleeding from 2 leg wounds, he climbed back up. Finally, a Union bullet struck him in the chest. This time when he fell, he couldn't climb back up. But even lying wounded at the base of the rock, he reportedly cursed his fellow soldiers for not helping him get back on top so he could keep fighting. William Barbie survived his wounds, but his actions that day became legendary, a symbol of the almost insane courage that characterized Hood's Texas Brigade. The Texans did capture Devil's Den, fighting among the rocks in brutal close-quarters combat. They pushed Union forces back, leaving the rocky ground covered with the dead and wounded from both sides. But they couldn't take Little Round Top. Union reinforcements arrived just in time to defend the hill in desperate fighting. The 20th Maine Infantry, out of ammunition, famously charged down the hill with bayonets and drove back the last Confederate assault. Little Round Top remained in Union hands. The failure to take Little Round Top meant that the Confederate attack on the second day of Gettysburg failed to achieve its objective. The Union line held, and on the third day, Lee's final massive assault, Pickett's Charge, would also fail. The Texans had fought with their usual ferocity, but this time it wasn't enough. Gettysburg was a Confederate defeat, and Hood's Texas Brigade had suffered heavy casualties for no strategic gain. After Gettysburg, after Antietam, after all the battles where they had been thrown into the breach and told to hold or die, Hood's Texas Brigade had earned a reputation as the best shock troops in the Army of Northern Virginia. When the line was breaking and a desperate counterattack was needed, the call went to the Texans. When an impossible position had to be taken, the Texans were sent. But reputation comes at a cost, and the Texans had paid in blood. Regiments that had left Texas with 1,000 men were now down to companies of 100. The faces around the campfires were younger now, as replacements filled the gaps left by the dead. Veterans who had survived both Antietam and Gettysburg were treated with quiet respect. They had walked through hell twice and somehow made it out alive. A young replacement soldier, newly arrived from Texas, might sit by the fire and listen to the veterans' stories. He'd hear about the cornfield at Antietam, about the rocks at Devil's Den, about comrades who had fallen and would never see Texas again. And he'd wonder if he would survive his first battle, or if he too would become a name on a list, another Texan who died far from home. The veterans, looking at the young replacement's fresh face, would remember when they looked like that, when they were new and untested and didn't yet know what war really meant. Some would try to prepare the new man for what was coming. Others would say nothing, knowing that no words could truly prepare someone for the reality of combat. "You'll do fine," an old sergeant might tell the replacement, his voice rough with tobacco and fatigue. "Just stick with the regiment and do what you're told. We take care of our own." The young soldier would nod, trying to look confident. But in his heart, he'd be wondering if taking care of their own would be enough when the bullets started flying and the world turned into smoke and screaming. Despite the terrible losses, Hood's Texas Brigade remained in service, fighting in battle after battle across Virginia. They were at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, all battles where men died in numbers that would have seemed impossible before the war. Each fight took more of the original Texans. Each battle left fewer of the men who had left home in 1861 full of excitement and confidence. The brigade that limped into the trenches around Petersburg in 1864 bore little resemblance to the force that had charged into the cornfield at Antietam. But they still fought. When the order came to advance, they still formed their lines and moved forward. The reputation of Hood's Texas Brigade was built on the bones of thousands of Texans who had given everything they had, and those who remained felt a duty to live up to that legacy, no matter what it cost them. As 1864 turned into 1865, as the Confederacy slowly collapsed under the weight of Union numbers and resources, the Texans of Hood's Brigade were still there, still in the trenches, still ready to fight one more time. They had come to Virginia to defend the Confederacy. They had stayed to defend each other and the memories of those who had fallen. And they would remain until the very end, when Robert E. Lee would finally surrender at Appomattox Courthouse and release them from their duty. Only then would the surviving Texans start the long journey home, carrying with them memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and stories of courage that would be told for generations. But while Hood's brigade fought in Virginia, other Texans were making their mark in different theaters of the war. In the Western Theater, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Georgia, other Texas units were writing their own chapters in blood and sacrifice. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video in this series, where we'll ride with Terry's Texas Rangers and march with Granberry's brigade through the Western Theater, where Texans would prove equally deadly in different kinds of warfare, and where they would face some of their darkest moments in battles that have largely been forgotten by history. If you have anything you'd like to see us cover, please let us know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious.